we were aware that politics for certain communities is not just about who wins elections. It can be about life and death.
We're going to start right off. Thank you so much for joining us. As the title suggests, we usually have pizza to share during this interview, but due to the pandemic, this is a virtual installment of Pizza and Politics, and there's no pizza here today. On the topic of pizza,
Okay, well, next time.
on the topic of pizza, what is a pizza topping that simply does not belong on pizza?
Pineapple.
Mm.
I think that's a little controversial, but moving on.
It is.
Yeah, we'd love to know how you got started in politics, and was there something specifically that inspired you to engage in civic life?
Well, no one in my family was ever involved in politics. We knew what was going on. I mean, as a Jewish family, we were aware that politics for certain communities is not just about who wins elections. It can be about life and death, and certainly that way for the Jewish community, that way for other communities as well. And so we always knew that you needed to be aware of what was going on and vote, et cetera. So, and then when I was a teenager, I started volunteering on campaigns. I don't know why, but I just started doing it and stayed involved in college and volunteered on campaigns. And then I tried, when I was in law school, I tried to get away from politics and focus on LGBTQ community work. And when I moved out to San Francisco, I had the same intention, but then I knew someone who was running, and so I got involved again, and just kept going.
Thank you so much. Could you tell us a bit about how your involvement with law and LGBTQ plus organizations before your political career, and how those experiences factor in into your ideas, and et cetera?
Well, my work as a lawyer, it was varied. I started out at a private law firm in downtown San Francisco for the first well, I started out, I clerked for a justice on the New Jersey Supreme Court, and where I helped do research and wrote opinions or drafts of opinions for him. And so he was a very progressive justice, and I learned a lot from him. And he was also, he was very opposed to death penalty, so we wrote a lot of, unfortunately, dissents where we advocated to overturn death sentences. And then I spent 5 years in private practice at a large downtown law firm, and was able to do a lot of pro bono work, defending tenants who were being evicted, low-income tenants, and representing asylum seekers from mostly Latin America, but also a little bit from Asia. And so I got, a taste early on of, like what it meant to be a low-income renter in a place like San Francisco, where housing is so expensive, and losing your apartment might mean that you have to leave the city. And then, when you're working with asylum seekers, you learn a lot about their life and about what they had to deal with in their home country. And so those, that helped shape my, my values. And then working in the city attorney's office for almost a decade, I really got to know the inner workings of government, and I saw the good, the bad, and the ugly. And particularly around policing, because we would work with the police department a lot. I saw, again, the really good cops that were out there. I saw the real problem cops, and I saw, what can go wrong. And so I got that sort of inside view. And then my work in the LGBTQ community, it's just who I am as a gay man. So it was an extension of my own, reality and my own lived experience. But I got to experience and sort of work with and learn from a broader cross-section of the LGBTQ community, including working with a lot of trans people, and learning and being mentored, frankly, by a number of really amazing trans people, working with, just people doing all sorts of different work in the community. We built the LGBTQ community center. I was part of the core group of people who did that. So being a lawyer, working in the community, it just really, I think, gave me perspective.
All right. So in the early 1990s, you worked on an HIV crisis line in North Carolina. So during a time when there were no effective treatments for the virus. So what made you want to work to help people with the virus that you knew so little about at that time?
Yeah, it was, you know, I still can visualize it. And it would have been maybe the end of August of 1990, beginning of junior year of college for me. And my sister was a freshman at the same college. And I remember telling her in a room, we were in a room, and I told her, she was the very first person I told. And then I gradually, over like the next 6 months, told everyone in my family, including my parents. So I came out August, September of 1990, and I just sort of decided I have to get involved and, you know, support my community. I'm like, okay, now I'm coming out, I need to do something. And I had heard that there was a AIDS crisis line, you know, right down the street from our campus. And so I started volunteering, and I just thought it was important. So I went through a training. And then I would, you know, I think it was like one night a week, I would go in for a few hours and answer the phones, and people would call, and it would be a combination of people who had just learned that they were positive and they were in just crisis. And then people who were worried, hadn't been tested and were scared to get tested and were worried they might be, sometimes rationally, sometimes not rationally. And then some people who just wanted information about how they can protect themselves. And so it was intense. It was very intense.
Moving on to more present matters, let's talk about your position as a state senator. What do you think being the biggest issues facing District 11, and how do you plan to tackle them?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, the biggest issue facing everyone right now is the pandemic and the, you know, the health impacts of that, and the unemployment and the small businesses struggling. So just stipulating that is, you know, that is the issue right now, and we're moving out of it, and we work really hard to make sure people can get unemployment benefits and food benefits, and small businesses can access the resources they need. So that's, you know, but in terms of long term, the top issue is absolutely housing, you know, and just the lack of affordability and the unsustainability of having a place, not just San Francisco, increasingly it's more and more of the Bay Area, where, you know, young families, working class families can't afford to live, where people are getting pushed out, where young people can't see a future for themselves. It's very unsustainable economically, in terms of diversity and segregation. It's also a climate issue as we push people to live further and further away from where they work. I would also say that mental health and addiction is a huge problem, and that is part of the homeless challenge, which is both housing related and for some homeless people, mental health related. But it's also for the general population. We make it too hard for people to get access to mental health treatment. And especially for young people, because we know that 50% of mental health conditions manifest by age 14 and 75% manifest by age 24. And yet we do not have nearly enough resources in our high schools and on our college campuses, just that youth can access to try to nip it in the bud if someone is starting to experience, you know, symptoms of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, or depression or anxiety. We want to get to that young person right away. And then of course, you know, drug use we try, you know, the strategy we've used for a long 50, 100 years, frankly, has been the war on drugs, and just to, you know, this notion that we can somehow just arrest and incarcerate people and people won't use drugs. And we know that's a failure. People use drugs probably more now than they did 50 years ago, despite the fact that we incarcerated millions and millions of people for drug offenses, fueling mass incarceration, taking money away from schools and healthcare. And so we're trying to say, let's treat drug use as a health issue, which it is, not as a criminal issue. And so we're really trying to move in that direction. But we've seen, and it was pre-pandemic, but the pandemic made it worse. We have record overdose deaths in this country last year, record overdose deaths in San Francisco, spikes all around California. Opioids and fentanyl are fueling it, but meth is a overdose problem as well. And so we're trying to take new approaches for how do we get people access to treatment, but try innovative new approaches like safe consumption sites, which I'm authoring legislation on that, where people, if they're going to use outdoors, which is sort of unhealthy and unsafe, where's a place you can go inside and do it in a healthier way, and maybe get access to recovery services or test your drugs to make sure there's no fentanyl laced into it.
Well, before we finish off our interview today, we'd like to talk about youth in government. How are some of the best ways that you think high school students can get involved in politics?
Well, I mean, there are a few things, and I was, volunteering on campaigns is great, and I've had some fantastic high school students volunteering on my campaigns, and you come out and go out and volunteer with the candidate or just working in the office. There's a lot of things you can do, and it's like a team effort, a lot of camaraderie, and I think it's really rewarding to do that. Also, interning in legislators' offices, and we typically have, it's probably more college students, but we've had high school students interning either in my capital office or my district office or in City Hall when I was in the Board of Supervisors. And that's also a really good way to, just to see how things work, whether you're working with constituents or helping with research on policy. So those are a few ways that people can pretty readily engage.